Imagine strolling through the busy streets of Renaissance Florence, the morning air tinged with the smell of bread rising from communal ovens, just one of many scattered throughout Tuscan cities. You pass neighbors queued outside, not just for the sake of convenience, but because these ovens are a fixture of daily life, a place where routines and relationships overlap. The sound of merchants setting up stalls, distant bells marking the hour, and the chatter of artisans fill the background. What did it feel like to depend on your neighborhood for even the simplest comforts, like your first meal of the day? In a world where connection was built into every ritual, the morning began with more than just food. Let's take a closer look at how that first meal set the tone for everything that followed. In Renaissance Florence, mornings began with a kind of quiet practicality that might surprise you. You wake up, roll out of a creaky bed, and the first thing on your mind isn't a lavish spread or a jolt of caffeine. It's bread. Not the soft, fluffy kind from a modern bakery, but a loaf you baked or bought days earlier, now a bit hard around the edges. Maybe you soften it with a splash of wine, if you have it, or just chew it as is. Breakfast is humble, but it does its job. There's no ceremony, no rush, and definitely no sugar-laden treats. The idea of a frosted pastry or a bowl of cereal would have sounded like a joke to most Florentines. Bread sits at the center of this morning ritual for a reason. It isn't just what's available, it's what keeps you going. In Florence, bread was so essential that entire guilds, like the Arte della Lana and Arte dei Fornai, kept a close eye on who milled the flour, how it was baked, and what went into each loaf. The city's 21 major guilds didn't just regulate luxury trades. They made sure the basics, like bread, were up to standard. In a place where a bad harvest could mean real hunger, bread was more than food. It was a measure of stability, a symbol of survival, and a reminder that your fortunes were tied to the land and your neighbors. The bread you eat each morning might be toasted if you're lucky, but it's rarely fresh unless you're wealthy or particularly well connected. For most, it's yesterday's loaf, and you make it last. Sometimes it's dipped in wine, which helps soften the crust and gives a touch of flavor. The use of vinegar to moisten bread is less clear. Wine was the common choice, and even that depended on what you had on hand. You eat slowly, not out of luxury, but because you want to savor what little you have. There's no rush to finish and no expectation of variety. Sugar, that everyday staple in modern breakfasts, was a rare sight. Unless you belonged to the upper crust, you likely never saw it at your table. Sweet breakfasts just didn't exist. The idea of starting your day with something sugary was as foreign as eating dessert for breakfast. Instead, you got bread, plain, filling, and reliable. That's how most people lived, and it shaped how they saw the world. Life was about making things last, stretching resources, and finding comfort in routine. But don't mistake this simplicity for misery. There's a kind of dignity in it. The morning meal set the pace for the day. Not too fast, not too slow, and never wasteful. Even the wealthy sometimes kept things plain, more out of principle than necessity. Florentines valued practicality and moderation. They saw breakfast as a moment to ground themselves before facing whatever the day had in store. There was no need to impress anyone with what you ate first thing in the morning. The bread itself was a product of the city's careful organization. Flour was milled locally, with the quality watched over by the guilds. A bad batch of flour or a poor harvest didn't just mean bland bread, it meant real hardship. Sometimes the bread was coarse and rough, other times a little better, depending on the year and your luck. Still, every bite connected you to a larger system. The bread you ate was the result of many hands. Farmers, millers, bakers, and guilds all played their part. When you sat down to breakfast, you weren't just feeding yourself. You were taking part in a city-wide ritual. This sense of connection ran deeper than just food. Sitting down for your morning bread wasn't about convenience, like grabbing a coffee on the way to work. It was a deliberate pause, a chance to appreciate what you had, however simple. You might share a few words with family, maybe nod to a neighbor through an open window. There was no distraction from screens or the pressure to multitask. Breakfast was quiet, steady, and communal, even if you ate alone. Compare that to today, where breakfast is often eaten in a hurry, maybe in the car or at a desk, and usually alone. Back then, eating alone in a rush would have seemed odd. The morning meal was about more than just filling your stomach. It was about starting the day with intention and a sense of belonging. Even in its simplicity, it brought people together, if only in spirit. After you finish your bread and wine, you don't linger. The city is waking up, and there's work to be done. The bread you just ate didn't come from nowhere. It's part of a chain of effort and cooperation that stretches across Florence. Soon, you'll be heading out, maybe with a basket of dough under your arm, ready to join your neighbors at one of the communal ovens scattered around the city. These ovens aren't just practical. They're where people meet, share news, and keep the rhythm of daily life going. The morning meal, simple as it is just the start. The real business of the day and the heart of the neighborhood awaits. But Florence had its share of challenges, and not all were solved by bread. The city was crowded, the streets narrow, and privacy was a luxury most couldn't afford. After the oven, there's another daily puzzle to solve: how to stay clean and presentable in a world without private bathrooms or easy access to soap. Keeping yourself presentable in Renaissance Florence was a constant negotiation between what you wanted and what you could actually manage. There's no faucet to turn, no bathroom door to close. Instead, cleanliness was a patchwork of habits, tools, and a fair bit of improvisation, less about luxury and more about making do with what you had. You'd start with the basics. Maybe you had a ceramic basin in your home, filled from the nearest fountain or well. That water wasn't always sparkling clean, but it was what you had for washing your hands, your face, and if you were feeling ambitious, your feet. Nobody expected a full-body rinse every morning. The goal was to look and smell presentable, not to scrub every inch spotless. Clean was a sliding scale, and most people aimed for good enough. When you needed a proper wash, you'd head to a public bathhouse. These weren't rare. Florence had several, and they served as social centers just as much as places to get clean. You might find yourself sitting in warm water next to a stranger, chatting about the latest city gossip, or negotiating a business deal. Bathing was communal by necessity, not by choice. Privacy was not on the menu. If you were lucky, you could afford regular visits. If not, you made do with quick washes at home and the occasional trip to the river. The River Arno and smaller streams running through the city did double duty as laundry stations and makeshift baths. Of course, with waste often dumped into the same water, you had to pick your spot carefully. There were risks: disease, pollution, and the occasional dead animal floating by. But for many, it was the only option. You'd see people scrubbing clothes on the rocks, children splashing around, and adults rinsing off as best they could. It was practical, if not exactly sanitary. Soap was a specialty rather than an everyday item. If you managed to get some, it was probably homemade from olive oil and ash. It worked, but it wasn't cheap, and it definitely wasn't something you'd use every day. The wealthy sometimes bought perfumed soaps, but for most, these were out of reach. Instead, people leaned on herbs, rosemary, lavender, sage, rubbed on the skin to mask odors or mixed into wash water. These herbal remedies did a passable job and became part of your personal routine. If you smelled faintly of lavender, it meant you'd put in the effort. Perfume played a huge role in the city's hygiene strategy. Not everyone could be clean, but anyone could try to smell better. Pomanders, small perforated containers filled with amber, musk, or other strong scents, were common accessories, especially among the better off. You'd hang one from a belt or carry it in your hand, breathing through it when the city's smells got overwhelming. It wasn't just about personal comfort. It was a subtle way to show status. If you could afford to mask the city's odors, you were doing well. Clothing itself became part of the hygiene puzzle. People changed their outer garments less often than you'd think. But undergarments, linen shirts, chemises, were washed more frequently when water was available. You'd see lines of laundry hanging from windows or across narrow alleys, a patchwork of white and off-white fluttering in the breeze. Washing clothes was a group effort, often done at public fountains or by the riverbank, with neighbors sharing tips and complaints in equal measure. Of course, all of this was set against the backdrop of a city where waste management was more hope than science. Without modern sewage, streets could be filthy, especially after rain. Officials tried to keep things under control, but the battle was uphill. You learned to step carefully and to keep a handkerchief handy for sudden gusts of unpleasant air. Water for washing wasn't always clean, and sometimes you had to choose between being a little dirty and risking something worse. Cleanliness was also tightly bound to social standing. The wealthy made a point of smelling good, not just for comfort, but to signal their place in the world. Perfumed gloves, fine clothes, and elaborate herbal concoctions marked you as someone above the daily struggle. For everyone else, it was about doing what you could, sharing herbal mixtures, trading tips, and sometimes just accepting that the city would leave its mark no matter what. What's striking is how communal this all was. Just like with the bread ovens, keeping clean in Florence was rarely a solo project. You'd fetch water together, help each other with laundry, and pass around homemade remedies. The struggle against dirt and odor became another way to build connections. If you couldn't keep the city clean, you could at least help your neighbor stay a little fresher. Even with all the challenges, there was pride in making the best of what you had. Every basin of water, every handful of herbs, every trip to the bathhouse was a small act of defiance against the grime and chaos outside your door. You weren't just cleaning yourself. You were holding on to a sense of dignity and belonging in a city that never really let you forget how close you lived to everyone else. The rhythm of keeping clean shaped your days, just like the rhythms of work and rest. You learned to time your bathhouse visits, your trips to the river, and your laundry days to fit the city's patterns. In a place with more than 80 feast days a year and constant movement in the streets, the routines of hygiene became part of the city's heartbeat. And as you step back into the flow of daily life, you start to notice another rhythm guiding your actions, one that isn't measured by a clock on the wall, but by the sun's angle, the sound of bells, and the patterns of work that fill the hours ahead. Work in Renaissance Florence wasn't measured by hours on a clock, but by the steady progression of daily routines and the signals that echoed through the city. The main bell tower kept everyone loosely in sync, ringing out the 5 canonical hours: matins, prime, terce, sext, and vespers. These bells didn't just call people to prayer. They told you when to open your shop, when to pause for a bite, and when to head home. If you lost track of the bells, you'd glance at the slant of sunlight or the length of a shadow on the wall. It was a system that made sense when you lived it, even if it sounds a little chaotic now. Without clocks to nag you, the pace of work felt different. You didn't have meetings scheduled down to the minute or alarms buzzing you out of bed. Instead, you learned to read the city itself. The market started to fill when the bells rang at prime. By the time the noon bell sounded, the streets quieted as everyone ducked inside for lunch. When the shadows grew long and the bells rang vespers, the city wound down. It was a rhythm that left room for small delays and chance conversations. If a neighbor needed help getting their bread out of the oven, you helped. If the dye for your fabric took longer to set, you waited. There was no sense in rushing. The city would keep moving at its own pace no matter what you did. Most people in Florence belonged to a world governed by guild networks. These guilds regulated trade, quality, and training for every craft you can think of. Wool merchants, shoemakers, bakers, even painters. The rules were strict. If you wanted to make a living, you followed the standards down to the last detail. How wide a bolt of cloth could be, which dyes were allowed, how many stitches per inch on a shoe. The guilds didn't just enforce quality, they protected trade secrets and made sure only trained workers could call themselves masters. They controlled everything from who could open a shop to where you could buy your supplies. Getting into a guild wasn't easy. If you were a boy with even a little luck, you might start as an apprentice around age 7. That meant moving in with a master and spending the next several years, sometimes up to 12, doing whatever needed to be done. You'd sweep floors, grind pigments, fetch water, and slowly learn the basics of the trade. The early years were all about discipline and repetition. You didn't touch the good tools or the best materials until you'd earned it. In a painter's workshop, you could spend years just mixing colors before anyone let you near a brush. Once your apprenticeship ended, you became a journeyman. Now you could earn wages, but you still worked under someone else's roof. The goal was to produce a masterpiece, a literal piece of work to prove you deserved the title of master. Only then could you open your own shop, train apprentices, and become a full member of the guild. Many never made it that far, but the system kept standards high and traditions intact. A typical day for an artisan started early, usually before sunrise. You'd light a lamp, set out your tools, and get to work. In the wool trade, you might spend the morning spinning and weaving, following strict patterns set by the guild. If you were a cobbler, you'd cut and stitch leather, careful to meet the guild's quality checks. Guild inspectors could show up at any time, measuring your work and checking your supplies. Slip up, and you risked a fine or losing your right to sell. But if you did things right, your mark went on every piece you finished, a sign that it met the standards of Florence. Not every guild was rigid all the time. The Arte dei Medici Speziali, for example, oversaw both physicians and apothecaries, but also painters, because they controlled pigments. That's how artists like Botticelli got their start. If you needed a special color, you had to go through the guild. This kind of flexibility let talent find a place, even in a system built on rules. The lack of precise timekeeping wasn't just about work. It shaped the way people interacted. Without a strict schedule, you had time to teach an apprentice how to hold a chisel, to talk with a customer about a new design, or to help a neighbor who'd run out of supplies. The city's rhythm made room for these moments. You could pause to listen to a story, share news, or lend a hand, knowing the bells would eventually call you back to your tasks. The products of all this work, woolen cloaks, silver jewelry, painted panels, didn't come from faceless workshops. Each piece carried the touch of someone you might know. Goods moved through many hands, from apprentice to master, from one guild member to the next. This created a sense of connection, not just to the work itself, but to the people who made and used it. When you bought a loaf of bread or a new pair of shoes, you knew whose hands had shaped them. As the day wound down and the bells rang out across the rooftops, the streets filled with people heading home. The pace slowed, but the sense of connection didn't stop at the workshop door. In Florence, work wasn't an isolated activity. It was woven into the fabric of the neighborhood, built on trust, reputation, and shared routines. And when something went wrong, a sudden illness, a broken roof, or a shortage of food, Florentines didn't just rely on their own resources. They turned to the people around them, drawing on the same networks that shaped their working lives. That's where the real strength of the city showed itself, in the everyday acts of support that made life in Florence possible. When disaster struck in Florence, whether it was a sudden flood that turned the streets into rivers or the city reeling in the aftermath of plague, your first instinct wasn't to wait for officials or outside help. You looked to the people living right around you. Neighbors weren't just faces you passed on the way to the market. They were the people you depended on when the world turned upside down. This wasn't some romanticized idea of togetherness. It was practical, even blunt, and it defined what it meant to survive in Renaissance Florence. Let's say the Arno overflowed its banks again, like it did in the infamous flood of 1333. Water would sweep through homes, shops, and workshops, leaving a mess nobody could handle alone. In those moments, the lines between families, trades, and even old grudges blurred. People formed bucket lines, hauled debris, and patched up broken walls together. There was no waiting for the city to send help. You and your neighbors got to work, because if you didn't, nobody else would. And when the Black Death swept through, wiping out entire neighborhoods, the survivors had to pull together to bury the dead, care for the sick, and somehow keep the city running. It was grim, but the only way forward was side by side. Food shortages were another regular crisis. Florence's markets might look lively, but a bad harvest or political upheaval could empty them in days. When that happened, the old Mezzadria system kicked in. This wasn't charity, it was survival math. Farmers and sharecroppers pooled their surplus, and in a pinch, neighbors would quietly pass along a sack of beans or a few onions. You might trade what you had for what you needed, and the whole neighborhood would keep an informal tally. If you ran out of flour, someone else probably had a little extra, and you'd pay it back when you could. The idea was simple. If one person went hungry, it put everyone at risk. So you shared, not out of generosity, but because you understood you might be the one in need next week. Emergencies made this interdependence even more obvious. Fires were a constant threat in the crowded city, with open flames everywhere and buildings packed tight. When a blaze broke out, there was no fire brigade. Neighbors shouted, formed lines to pass buckets, and tried to save what they could. Afterward, everyone pitched in to rebuild. If you had carpentry skills, you grabbed a hammer. If not, you hauled rubble or fetched supplies. The city's resilience wasn't about heroics. It was about showing up and doing what needed to be done, over and over. When it came to health, the options weren't great. Hospitals existed, but they were limited and often reserved for the desperate or the dying. Most people relied on local knowledge. Sometimes the old woman who knew which herbs to use for a fever, or the convent that offered hospice care when sickness struck. Convents played a quiet but crucial role, caring for the ill and offering comfort when there was little else to be done. These weren't formal healthcare systems, but they filled the gaps left by the city's limited resources. If you needed help, you turned to whoever was closest and willing, trusting that the same would be done for you. The church and its institutions added another layer to this safety net. Confraternities, those lay religious groups, stepped in where the city fell short. They handed out alms, made sure the poorest had something to eat, and even provided dowries for brides who couldn't afford them, as church records show. Monasteries and convents doubled as places of refuge, education, and emergency shelter. If you lost your home or your family, these places could be the difference between survival and despair. The church's help wasn't always free or without strings, but it was woven into the fabric of daily life, and everyone knew how to find it. Of course, not every act of support was about disaster. Sometimes, resilience showed up in smaller, quieter ways. You'd slip an extra loaf of bread to a neighbor whose luck had run out, or share a flask of wine after a long, punishing day. These small gestures built trust, an invisible web that made it easier to ask for help when you really needed it. If you looked out for others, you could count on them to look out for you. It wasn't always fair, and it wasn't always pretty, but it worked. Florence wasn't some utopia of neighborly love. People argued, held grudges, and sometimes let old feuds get in the way of cooperation. But underneath it all, there was a shared understanding. You were stronger together than alone. The city's constant threats, plague, famine, fire, political chaos, meant that everyone had a stake in the community's survival. You learned to trust the people next door, not because you liked them, but because you had to. Walking home at the end of the day, you might pass a neighbor patching up a wall, or see someone delivering a basket of food to a family in mourning. These weren't grand scenes of charity. They were the routines that kept the city alive. The comfort you found in Florence didn't just come from stone walls or warm bread. It came from knowing that, for all the city's unpredictability, you could rely on the people around you. But resilience wasn't the only thing that defined daily life. Even with all the hardship, Florentines knew how to find enjoyment in the small things. There were comforts and pleasures woven into the rhythm of the day, waiting to be noticed. Let's talk about what actually made life feel good in Renaissance Florence, even when everything else seemed stacked against you. Simple comforts weren't just background noise. They were the main event. There was no endless scroll, no streaming service, no delivery app to bail you out. Instead, you found contentment in the kinds of things most of us ignore now. It could be as ordinary as standing in a crowded piazza, hearing the layered harmonies of a polyphonic ballata drifting through the air, or tearing into a hunk of bread that still held the warmth of the communal oven. In a world where time moved at the pace of the sun and the bells, these were the moments that actually meant something. Music was everywhere, and it was more than just a distraction. It was a shared experience. Florence in the 14th century saw the rise of the Italian ars nova, a new style of music that brought complexity and emotion to secular life. You'd hear madrigals and ballate echoing through the streets, not just in palaces or churches, but in the open air, where anyone could stop and listen. It didn't matter if you were a wool merchant, a shoemaker, or just a kid running errands. If the music caught you, you stopped. For a few minutes, you stood shoulder to shoulder with strangers, letting the sound carry you somewhere else. The best part? It didn't cost a thing. The city became your concert hall, and everyone got a front row seat. Religious music had its own pull, especially during the city's many feast days. Florence marked more than 80 feast days each year, according to church records. These weren't just excuses to skip work, though nobody complained about that. On these days, churches filled with the sound of choral masses and motets. Even if you didn't care much for sermons, you couldn't ignore the way the music lifted the mood. The city transformed, streets decorated, processions winding past. Everyone dressed a little better than usual. Sometimes it was solemn, sometimes it was wild, but it always felt like a break from the grind. If you were lucky, you'd get swept up in a dance or find yourself singing along, even if you couldn't carry a tune. Then there was bread. No matter how fancy your family was or wasn't, bread was the great equalizer. The wealthy had soft, white manchet bread, while most people made do with coarse, heavy rounds. But when it came out of the oven, nobody cared about class. The smell alone could pull you out of bed or draw a neighbor to your door. Breaking bread wasn't just about eating. It was about routine, comfort, and knowing that, at least for today, you had something to share. You might not remember every meal, but you'd remember the feeling of warmth in your hands, and maybe the company you kept while you ate. Art wasn't just for the elite, either. Sure, the rich commissioned the big stuff, frescoes, statues, whole buildings. But Florence itself was a gallery. You'd walk past Brunelleschi's dome and wonder how it stayed up, or get lost in the geometric lines of an Alberti-designed palazzo. Even if you didn't know the names, you couldn't miss the effect. The city's beauty was public, not locked away. You didn't need a ticket or an invitation to enjoy it. Just living in Florence meant you got to see something extraordinary on the way to buy onions or visit a friend. Faith worked its way into daily life too, but not just in the ways you might expect. Going to church was less about obligation and more about taking a breath. The cool air, the flicker of candles, the smell of incense. It was a reset button in a world that rarely slowed down. Churches weren't just places for prayer. They were where you marked the big moments: baptisms, weddings, funerals. These events pulled the whole community together, giving you a sense of belonging even if you didn't know everyone by name. Storytelling filled in the gaps between the big events. People gathered in piazzas, kitchens, or under the arches of a loggia to trade tales, sometimes gossip, sometimes full-blown legends. The best storytellers could quiet a crowd with nothing but their voice. These weren't grand performances. They were everyday magic, a way to pass the time and make sense of the world. If you were lucky, you'd hear a story that made you laugh, think, or just forget your own problems for a while. Festivals were the city's way of letting off steam. With more than 80 feast days a year, there was always an excuse to celebrate. Lanterns lit up the streets, people wore whatever passed for their best, and the city felt lighter, even if only for a day. Children darted between crowds, adults swapped stories and wine, and for a little while the worries of work and survival faded into the background. These weren't just parties. They were reminders that life didn't have to be all struggle, all the time. Even the wealthy found comfort in simple things. Perfumed gloves masked the city's less pleasant smells, and a weekly bath was considered an indulgence. The elite might have had more options, but the basics, good bread, music, art, and community, still mattered. The line between luxury and simplicity blurred, because even the grandest palace couldn't offer more than a moment of real contentment. Florentine life was built around these small, accessible joys. They didn't erase hardship, but they made it bearable. Fires, floods, plagues, none of it stopped the music, the baking, or the stories. These comforts didn't just distract from difficulty, they gave people a reason to keep going. The city's resilience wasn't just about surviving disaster. It was about finding meaning in the ordinary and turning shared routines into something worth holding on to. If you look closely, you might realize that the secret to Florentine happiness wasn't hidden in grand gestures or rare luxuries. It was right there in the everyday, in the things everyone could touch, taste, or hear. That's what kept people steady, even when everything else was uncertain. And maybe that's the real lesson. How much strength and comfort can be found in simple routines, shared spaces, and the company of others. Florentine life wasn't about excess or comfort. For Renaissance Florentines, limited resources fostered deep neighborly ties, shaped by civic pride and the city's Republican spirit. The legacy of Renaissance Florence lies as much in the everyday lives of its people as in its famous art. Communal ovens and church bells once set the rhythm, reminding everyone that daily life was built around shared effort and public rituals. So, what could you change to make your own day feel a little more grounded? Maybe it's sharing a meal, reaching out to someone nearby, or finding meaning in a small routine. Let me know in the comments. What's your version of a neighborhood ritual or tradition? And centuries from now, who knows what future generations will notice in the patterns of our everyday lives?